On April 12, 1993, 22-year-old Anabel Segura left her home in La Moraleja outside Madrid and went for a run. She never came back. The disappearance hit hard immediately because there were signs from the very beginning that this was not a case of someone simply wandering off or losing contact. There were indications of force. Witnesses reported seeing a young woman being taken in a white van. Some of Anabel's belongings were found left behind in the street. It looked abrupt, violent, and deliberate, the kind of disappearance that seems impossible to pull off in daylight in a wealthy residential area with people nearby. That alone would have been enough to make the case unforgettable. A young woman disappears while jogging, in a place where people should have seen something, heard something, remembered something. It felt immediate and solvable. It felt like the kind of case where a break should come quickly. Instead, it turned into one of Spain's most haunting, long-form mysteries. The kidnappers began calling the family and demanding money. That changed the entire emotional landscape of the case. This was no longer just a disappearance. Now it looked like an active hostage case. There was still contact. There were still demands. There was still a sense, however fragile, that the right move, the right payment, or the right breakthrough might bring Anabel alive home. The ransom demand was enormous, reported at 150 million pesetas, and the instructions shifted over time. Planned exchanges failed. Negotiations dragged on. The calls continued. And then came the thing that kept the hope alive longer than almost anything else could have: a tape. A cassette was sent as proof of life. On it was a frightened female voice presented as Anabel's. And that matters, because once a case reaches that point, hope stops being abstract. It becomes concrete. It has a sound. It has a shape. It gives a family something to cling on to, even if the thing is fragile and terrible and incomplete. As long as there was a voice, there was something to believe in. And they did believe. Spain believed too. The case became huge. It spread through the media, through television, through public appeals. Years later, El País would describe it as a case that deeply shaped Spanish media coverages of disappearances. The program Quien Sabe Donde aired the kidnappers' recordings in 1995 as part of the effort to identify them, turning the case into a national spectacle of dread, hope, and public participation. People weren't just hearing about a missing woman. They were hearing the voices tied to her disappearance and listening for a clue that might end it. And that is part of what makes this case so cruel in hindsight, because the mystery the public was following was one thing, the truth was something else entirely. For almost 2.5 years, roughly 900 days, the case continued as if it were still alive. Police pursued leads. The public listened to recordings. Families waited through silence, then fresh demands, then new uncertainty. The case was not static. It kept moving, which is often worse. A case that fully goes cold is one kind of nightmare. A case that keeps pretending it still has a living center is another. Then, in September 1995, the case cracked. Police arrested Emilio Munoz and Candido Ortiz. Felicia Garcia was also implicated for helping sustain the fiction that Anabel was still alive. Authorities said she had impersonated Anabel's voice on the tape used as proof of life. This was the moment where everything shifted. Not because the mystery vanished, but because the shape of it changed completely. According to reporting after the arrest, Anabel Segura had been dead within hours of her abduction. El País reported that she had been strangled with a rope around 9:30 p.m. on the same day she was kidnapped, April 12, 1993, at an abandoned factory in Numancia de la Sagra in Toledo. Other reporting tied the murder to failed ransom efforts and to Anabel attempting to escape. However you phrase it, the core truth is the same. The long kidnapping Spain had been following was, in reality, a murder case almost from the very beginning. This is what makes the case so much worse than the mystery people thought they were watching. For years the question had been, where's Anabel? Can she still be rescued? Is she waiting somewhere, hearing all of this, hoping someone reaches her in time? But the people making those calls already knew how the story ended. It's not just tragic, it's psychologically vicious. It means the hope in the case was being fed from the same place that the horror came from. The very thing keeping the family going, the calls, the tape, the sense that negotiations still mattered was, according to the case that emerged later, part of the deception itself. Anabel was not out there hearing those efforts. She was not waiting for a rescue that almost happened. The public drama, the negotiations, the obsessive listening, the national attention, all of it had been built around a center that was already gone. And there's something especially bleak about that kind of crime. Because most people understand the horror of abduction. Most people understand the horror of murder. But this case added another layer, the prolonged manipulation of hope. Not days, not weeks, years. Eventually, after all the arrests, police were led to Anabel's remains, and the case finally had the thing it had missing for the whole time. A fixed truth. The uncertainty ended. The mystery had an answer. But instead of making the case smaller, the answer had made it feel heavier. A disturbing abduction became a case in which the country had been following the illusion of a rescue long after rescue was no longer possible. That is why Anabel Segura's case still lands so hard. Not just because she was taken, but because the truth did not merely explain the mystery, it poisoned it. The second case begins in New Hampshire, in the woods near Brook State Park. In November 1985, a hunter made a discovery in Allenstown that immediately told police something terrible had happened. He found a 55-gallon metal drum. Inside were the remains of an adult woman and a young girl. They had not simply been left in the woods, they had been sealed away, hidden in a barrel, in a place where they could easily have remained undiscovered much longer if the wrong person had taken the wrong path that day. That should have been one of those cases that gets solved quickly, not because it was simple, but because it was so stark. A woman and a child, hidden in a barrel in the woods, is not the kind of thing that feels random or accidental. It suggests planning. It suggests concealment. It suggests that someone didn't just want to kill, they wanted to erase. But the case didn't resolve. It stalled in one of the worst possible states a homicide can stall in, when the victims are still largely unknown. Police had remains, they had a location, they had a method of concealing so disturbing it was impossible to forget. But they did not have the full identities of the dead, and without that, the case had a strange emptiness to it. There were bodies, but no complete story. There was horror, but not yet a narrative. For years, the case remained suspended there. Then, 15 years later, in May 2000, it got worse. Another barrel was found in the same vicinity. Inside were the remains of 2 more girls. That changes everything. A single barrel in the woods is already horrifying. 2 barrels, found years apart, with children inside both discoveries, creates a different kind of dread entirely. It means the first discovery was not the whole shape of the crime. It means the original horror was only part of it. And perhaps more disturbingly, it means that for 15 years, the full scope of the case had been sitting out there in the same area, waiting to be found. Now the mystery wasn't just who are these victims, it was also how many people are we looking at? What kind of person does this? And how long has the truth been sitting there, unrecognized? Investigators eventually concluded the 4 deaths were homicide and that blunt force trauma was the cause of the death. They also worked with a broad time frame, concluding the killings likely occurred sometime between the late 1970s and early 1980s. But even with those pieces, the case remained maddeningly incomplete. The victims came to be known as the Allenstown 4, or more commonly the Brook victims, a title that says a lot about how cold case investigations work. When the names are missing, the place takes over. The woods become the identity. And that is part of what made Brook so haunting for so long. There was no clean suspect, no dramatic confession, no neat explanation. Just barrels, bones, and the sense that an entire set of lives had been cut off so completely that even the basic fact of who these people were had been buried alongside them. Then, the science caught up. Through DNA testing, and later the broader use of genetic genealogy, investigators began identifying victims and tying the case to Terry Rasmussen, a violent drifter who moved through multiple states under multiple aliases, including Bob Evans. Rasmussen had already been linked to other serious crimes, including the murder of Yoon Sun-jun in California, and he died in prison in 2010. But even after his death, the Brook case kept changing as more of the puzzle came into focus. That part is important, because Brook did not suddenly become terrifying in one moment. It got worse in layers. First the barrel, then the second barrel, then the realization that the case involved multiple children, then the identification of Rasmussen as the man at the center of it, and then, even after that, more. In 2019, 3 of the victims were publicly identified as Marlise Honeychurch and her daughters, Mary Elizabeth Vaughn and Sarah Lynn McWaters. That should have brought a sense of closure, and in one way it did. 3 victims were no longer faceless. They had names again. Families could finally attach the horror to real people instead of forensic descriptions. But it also made the case more painful, because now the body in the woods were no longer an abstract tragedy. There were a woman and her children hidden in barrels for decades. One victim still remained unidentified. Investigators referred to her as the middle child. They knew she was biologically related to Rasmussen, but for years they could still not give her a name. So even after identifying the killer's connection to the case, one of the central questions remained open. And because of that, the case retained one final pocket of darkness. One child, still unnamed, still suspended in the cold case void. Then, in 2025, New Hampshire authorities announced that the final unidentified victim had been identified as Rhea Rasmussen, born in 1976 in Orange County, California. She was Terry Rasmussen's biological daughter. That is the detail that changes this case emotionally. Because before that announcement, Bear Brook was already a nightmare. Multiple victims, including children, hidden in barrels in the wood by a violent predator. But once the final child got her name back, the truth became even darker. One of those girls was not just another victim who happened to fall into Rasmussen's orbit. She was his daughter. That turns the case from a cold case mystery into something even more intimate and sickening. It's one thing to uncover that a killer murdered a woman and a child connected to her. It's another thing entirely to realize that among the dead was a killer's own child, a detail that had remained buried for decades, waiting for science to drag it into the light. And even there, the case does not fully stop darkening. According to the New Hampshire Department of Justice, Rhea's mother was Pepper Reed, who was born in 1952, was originally from Texas, and had not been seen since the late 1970s. That means that even after identifying the final victim, the case still points towards another missing woman connected to Rasmussen, another life possibly swallowed into that same orbit of violence. That's what makes the Bear Brook so equally disturbing. Every major breakthrough made it worse. Not because investigators were wrong before, but because each new answer expanded the size of the horror. The more truth came into focus, the less survivable the story felt. What began as a barrel in the woods became a long-buried sequence of murders, hidden under aliases, distance, time, and the eerie fact that one of the children left there was the killer's own daughter.